Welcome to this brief video demonstrating ways of managing controls with FactoryStudio. Let's get started. It's a common practice in creating HMI screens to lock controls under various conditions. In some cases, customers want to have the controls remain visible, even if a message is displayed over them. Others may want to apply opacity to the controls or have the controls disappear completely. FactoryStudio has many ways of accomplishing these needs. We'll explore a few of them here. On this display, the controls are configured to toggle values used to set the fill color properties for the controls. If I click on a few of them here, you can see the colors changing. For demonstration purposes, the slide switch seen here at the left is configured to toggle a digital value between 0 and 1. This represents a condition to be used to disable the controls. When the condition occurs, we have a rectangle with text that overlays the controls at the top, which become disabled. In this example, the rectangle appears over the buttons when the digital tag is set to 1 and disappears when the digital tag is set to 0. There's the digital tag being set to 1 and the rectangle appears. Here's it being set to 0 and it disappears. We also have one of the buttons disappear down here in the lower left, and it reappears when the tag is set back to 0. At the remaining buttons here, we set the opacity property. The control on the right also has security applied to it so that only the user named administrator will be able to use it. We're currently logged in as administrator, but when we log in as something else, say guest, I can no longer use that button, and you see that this button on the left disappears. When I log back in as administrator, the control at the left reappears. Let's see how these effects were created. In the engineering environment, we have the display open in the FactoryStudio Draw tool. Over these buttons, we see the rectangle with text, which is visible when the underlying controls are disabled. By double-clicking on the rectangle, we see the visibility property is controlled by the tag DP9. And that's all that's needed. When DP9 is true, the rectangle appears. The same digital tag is used on each of the controls the rectangle covers to disable them when the digital tag is set to 1. But how do we work with overlaying objects in the engineering environment? Let's say we want to make a change to one of the buttons. How do we access it with the rectangle over it? It's really quite simple. With the rectangle selected, press the Hide Selected Element icon in the lower right hand corner of the interface. That removes the rectangle. Now I'm free to make any changes I want to my controls. Since we're in the controls, we'll show you how they're configured. We see here we have an action. The action is to toggle a value DP6 in this case. We have security set, so when DP9, which again is being set by the slide switch, is true, the control will become disabled. And finally, here's the fill color, so that when the value is 0 we have green, when the value is 1 we have red. That's common across all the controls on this display and is very simple to do. Once the items that were covered by the rectangle are completely configured, we can press the Show All Elements button to show the rectangle again. In some cases, we could have many objects stacked on top of each other, as with these 4 squares. How can we access a specific one? Again, by using the Hide Selected Element tool. So I'm going to take these 4, which from back to foreground go from blue to green to yellow to red. So I'm going to center align them both vertically and horizontally. Okay, so now how do I access the green element? Very simple. I click on the top element and I hide it. Click on the next one and I hide it. And here's my green element. So now I can make whatever changes, assign whatever properties, whatever I need to do to that element. And once I'm done, click on the Show All Elements button again, and now all my other elements are returned. Okay. Now, back to the controls. At the bottom of this display, there are 3 more controls. All the controls at the bottom are configured to be disabled using the same digital tag we used before, DP9. So if we go to Security, we see DP9. However, this button is also configured so that only the administrator will be able to use it. So if the user is anything other than the administrator, they will not be able to use the button. But also, when the security is disabled, when DP9 is true, we see we are changing the opacity from being fully visible to being invisible, 1 to 0. So that means if anyone other than the administrator is logged in, that button becomes invisible. And even if the administrator is logged in and DP9 is selected, the button is invisible. The button in the center is configured to have opacity assigned to it as well. So here we have when DP9 is set to 1, we go from opacity from being fully visible to having half opacity. And finally, this last object is a grouped object. So if we ungroup, we see that we have a circle with text behind it. So when we change the opacity to the circle, we'll be able to see the text. Go back and put that as it was. So those are the key elements to assigning the opacity, to assigning security and visibility attributes to objects in runtime, as well as working with overlaying objects in the engineering environment. Again, we'll run through it one more time. When the slide switch is set, the button on the left disappears. These buttons, the opacity is set. This button has a text object behind it, and the rectangle with the text in it is over the buttons, which are also disabled. When I set that button back to 0, everything is now active, and because I'm logged in as administrator, I can use all the controls. When I change the login from administrator to guest, my one button disappears. I can still use all the other controls except for the one that was only to be used by administrator. Finally, rather than using the tag name DP9, if I want to change the tag to something more descript, I can go into the FactoryStudio tag database and change it to a tag such as disable controls. Because FactoryStudio uses database technology to store all of its project configurations, now anywhere DP9 was used before automatically refers to disable controls. So if we go to the security, there's disable controls. If we come here and click on this, disable controls. If we come here and click on this, disable controls. So there's no need for a global search and replace or any other sort of operation when changing tag names in FactoryStudio. In conclusion, in this video we demonstrated applying security, visibility, and opacity to controls for runtime operations, and demonstrated how to use the Hide Selected Element feature in the engineering environment to work with layered objects. We look forward to working with you soon. For more information, please visit us at www.tatsoft.com and look for other Tatsoft videos online.